Breathe in the math, breathe out the bullet.
The Barrett M82. A one weighed 30.9 pounds, and Specialist Tuyen Ngo had never fired one. She knew this, the way she knew everything about the weapons in her arms room, by serial number, by technical manual, by the hours she'd spent inventorying every component, while the men who used them never learned her name. Serial T. 41. Cage 7. 10 rounds of Raufoss make 211, in ammo cage 3, lot number November Alpha 7724. She could recite the specifications in her sleep: the recoil velocity, the trigger pull weight, the muzzle energy at 500 meters. She had never pulled the trigger. Below her, Camp Resolute was burning. The eastern perimeter had collapsed 12 minutes ago, and from the rooftop of Supply Building 3, she could see the breach, a ragged mouth in the T-wall, where the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device had detonated, fire and rubble and shapes moving through the smoke, with weapons she could catalog at a glance. PKM, AK pattern, RPG-7. The PKM was killing her people. She could see the muzzle flash a strobing pulse from behind a sandbag position, 720 meters east. Tracers raking the motor pool, where the quick reaction force crouched behind burning vehicles. She could hear Sergeant First Class Petrova's voice on the radio she'd grabbed from the hallway, thin and cracking. Actual. Quick reaction force is pinned. 2 urgent surgical. We need fire on that position now. Nobody answered. Tuyen pressed the Barrett stock into her shoulder. The metal was cold through her t-shirt. Blood from the shrapnel wound in her left thigh had pooled beneath her knee, warm and wrong. Ong Ngo's voice. From the farm. From 20 years ago. Breathe in the math. Breathe out the bullet. She exhaled. 17 minutes earlier, she had been asleep. The fluorescent tubes in the arms room buzzed at a frequency that Specialist Tuyen Ngo had long suspected was calibrated to erode sanity. 60 hertz. The same pitch as the generators outside, the same pitch as the refrigeration unit in the mess hall, the same pitch as every institutional light fixture the United States Army had installed in every forgettable room, on every forgettable base, from Fort Jackson to Camp Resolute. She'd been listening to it for 14 months. She could hear it in her dreams. She stood in the center of the arms room with a clipboard and a penlight, conducting the weekly inventory that nobody had ever asked to see, but that regulations required her to complete every Thursday by 1600 hours. She was 19 minutes ahead of schedule. She was always ahead of schedule. There was nothing else to be. Camp Resolute occupied a limestone plateau in Gaziantep province, southeastern Turkey, 12 kilometers from a border that the maps insisted was Syrian, but that the reality suggested belonged to whoever had the most ammunition on any given Tuesday. The base housed 2nd Company, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, the Bastards of Bastogne, though nobody in the current rotation had earned the name and most couldn't spell it. 143 personnel, including the support platoon where Tuyen existed with the prominence of a floor tile. She moved down the row. M4. A. 1 carbines. In cages 1 through 4, 112 receivers. Serial numbers logged. Optic mounts inspected. Bore conditions noted. M249 saws in cage, 518, all operational. 2 with worn feed tray covers she'd reported twice and been ignored twice. M240B machine guns in cage 66, 1 deadlined for a cracked gas regulator she'd requisitioned a replacement for 31 days ago. Cage 7. She stopped. The Barrett M82A. 1 sat on its rack like a sleeping predator. Flat, dark, earth finish. 57 inches of steel and polymer. The loopholed Mark IV scope, mounted and bore-sighted per standing operating procedure, 4-12, which Tuyen had written herself because the previous version was 3 years out of date and referenced a scope model the Army no longer issued. Serial number 0.041, 30.9 pounds unloaded. Effective range, 1,800 meters. Maximum range, 6,800 meters. Ammunition, 50 BMG, stored in ammo cage 3. She touched the padlock with her key. The metal was cool. She did this every Thursday, ran her finger along the lock, confirmed it was secure, and moved on. The Barrett was a garrison defense weapon, a contingency asset that no one in the company was currently qualified to operate. Because the last Barrett-qualified soldier had PCS to Fort Bragg 4 months ago, and Captain Hargrove hadn't bothered to schedule a replacement qualification. Tuyen was not qualified on the Barrett. Not officially. Her military occupational specialty didn't require it. Her chain of command hadn't offered it, and no one had thought to ask whether the supply clerk, who inventoried the weapon every week, might want to learn how to use it. She had asked. Once, Staff Sergeant Brock Cahill, the armorer, had been cleaning an M9 at his workbench when she'd approached him 2 months into her assignment. She'd rehearsed the question professional, specific, by the book. Staff Sergeant, I'd like to request cross-training on the M82A1. I'm available during range maintenance periods and I've reviewed the technical manual. Cahill had looked up from the M9 with an expression that suggested she'd asked to borrow his firstborn. Ngo, right? Supply? Yes. Staff Sergeant, the Barrett isn't a supply item, Specialist. It's a weapon system. There's a difference. He'd gone back to the M9. Stay in your lane. She had stayed in her lane. For 12 more months, she had stayed in her lane, counting crates, logging serial numbers, filing requisition forms that no one read, and touching the Barrett's padlock every Thursday like a prayer she didn't believe would be answered. Her grandfather would have called it patience. Her mother would have called it stubbornness. Tuyen called it inventory. She marked the Barrett as operational. 0 rounds expended this quarter, and moved to the ammunition cages. From outside, distant but persistent, came the thump of mortar impacts. Routine harassment fire from across the border, 2 or 3 rounds every few days, never accurate enough to cause casualties, never consistent enough to ignore. The ceiling shed a fine mist of limestone dust. Tuyen didn't flinch. Nobody flinched anymore. That was the problem with routine. It made you comfortable with the sound of things designed to kill you. She finished the inventory at 1,541 hours. 19 minutes early. She filed the report, locked the arms room, and hung the key on her belt where it had lived every day since she'd arrived at Camp Resolute. The key weighed 47 grams. She knew because she'd weighed it once, out of boredom, on the postal scale. Tonight it would be the heaviest thing she carried. The first rifle Tuyen Ngo ever held was older than her father. An M1 Garand, serial number 3,247,881, manufactured by Springfield Armory in 1944 and carried across the Pacific by a man whose name had been lost to paperwork and time. It had passed through a dozen hands before reaching Ngo Van Khan in 1971, a gift from an American military advisor in Pleiku who told Khan it was the finest infantry rifle ever built, and then died 3 weeks later in an American military advisor. Ambush that Khan survived by shooting 4 North Vietnamese soldiers with the weapon the American had given him. Khan Ong Noi to his grandchildren, a term that carried more weight than any rank the ARVN had ever pinned on his collar, brought the Garand to America. He brought it through the fall of Saigon in April 1975, hidden beneath rice sacks in a fishing boat that barely survived the South China Sea. He brought it through 3 years in a re-education camp outside Ho Chi Minh City, where he'd buried it in a water buffalo pen and trusted his wife to keep the secret. He brought it through Cambodia, through Thailand, through the refugee processing center in the Philippines, and eventually to a 60-acre tobacco farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where he intended to die in a country that owed him nothing and had given him everything. Tuyen was 7 when he first put a rifle in her hands. Not the Garand Ruger 10/22, bolt action, 22 long rifle. The kind of starter weapon that every rural Virginia child learned on the way suburban children learn to ride bicycles. He set up tin cans at 50 meters along the fence line behind the tobacco barn and said nothing while she missed 17 times in a row. He said nothing because Ngo Noi believed that teaching was not about words. It was about repetition. And repetition was about patience. And patience was about understanding that the world would not rearrange itself to accommodate your limitations. You rearranged yourself. You adapted. You fired the 18th round, and when it hit the can, you did not celebrate. You loaded the 19th. By age 12, the Ruger was too small. Ngo Noi brought out the Garand. The M1 weighed 9.5 pounds and kicked like a provoked mule. The first time Tuyen fired it, the recoil drove the stock into her shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted 2 weeks. She cried. Not from pain, from frustration. She'd missed the steel silhouette at 400 meters by what felt like the width of the entire mountain range. Again, Ngo Noi said. She fired. Missed. Again. Missed. 8 rounds. 8 misses. The Garand's en-bloc clip ejected with its distinctive ping and sailed into the grass. Tuyen's shoulder was a single unified ache from collarbone to elbow. Her eyes burned. Ngo Noi, I can't. You are not shooting. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking. His hands calloused from 50 years of gripping rifles and tobacco stems, adjusting the Garand's position against her shoulder. You are fighting the rifle. Stop fighting. The rifle is not your enemy. The distance is not your enemy. He tapped her temple with one finger. This is the weapon. The rifle is just the tool. He loaded another clip. Breathe in the math, he said. The distance. The wind. The drop. Let the numbers fill your lungs. She inhaled. Now, breathe out the bullet. She exhaled. Found the pause between heartbeats, the stillness her grandfather called Quang Larng, the quiet gap where the crosshairs stopped trembling and the world became geometry. She fired. The steel silhouette at 400 meters rang like a bell. Ngo Noi said nothing. He loaded another clip. That silence was the loudest praise she would ever receive, and she carried it with her through high school, through basic combat training at Fort Jackson, through advanced individual training, where her drill sergeant watched her shoot expert on every platform and wrote a recommendation that the Army filed and forgot, and through 14 months at Camp Resolute, where nobody knew her name and the only rifle she touched was locked in a cage. Until tonight. The mortar alarm shrieked through the barracks at 0, 3, 4, 7 hours, and Specialist Tuyen Ngo woke with Ngo Noi's voice already in her head, counting. The first explosion was not a mortar. Tuyen knew the difference. 14 months of harassment fire had taught every soldier at Camp Resolute the specific percussion of an 82 mm mortar impact, a whistling descent, a sharp crack, a plume of limestone dust. This was deeper, a detonation that she felt in her sternum before she heard it. A concussion wave that buckled the barracks wall inward and slammed her off her cot onto the concrete floor. She was on her feet before the dust settled. Training. Not combat training, basic training. The reflexive muscle memory of getting vertical when something goes wrong, of reaching for boots and equipment in the dark. Her boots were beside the cot. Her PT shorts and brown t-shirt were what she'd slept in. Her body armor was in her locker, 3 steps away. The second explosion, this one, a mortar. She was certain hit somewhere north of the barracks. Close. The fluorescent light above her cot shattered. Emergency lighting kicked on, bathing the bay in the red glow that meant the base power grid had switched to backup generators. Shouting. Boots on concrete. Soldiers moving in the red dark, some toward their equipment, others toward the doors. Nobody was giving orders yet. The attack was less than 15 seconds old, and the chain of command was still catching up to the violence. Tuyen pulled her boots on without lacing them. She did not go to her locker for body armor. She went for the door. The hallway outside the barracks was a chaos of limestone dust and emergency lighting. 3 soldiers ran past her toward the Tactical Operations Center, the compound's nerve center, where Captain Hargrove would be assembling whatever response he could manage. From outside, the sound of automatic weapons fire. Not the measured bursts of trained soldiers, but the sustained, undisciplined rattle of fighters who had ammunition to waste. She turned left, away from the Tactical Operations Center, toward the arms room. The corridor between the barracks and Supply Building 3 was open air, covered by a corrugated metal roof that offered shade but no protection. She crossed it at a run, her unlaced boots slapping concrete. A mortar round impacted somewhere behind her 50 meters, maybe 60, and peppered her legs with gravel. Something bit into her left thigh, sharp and hot. She stumbled, caught herself on the wall, looked down. A fragment of something metal, stone, she couldn't tell, had punched through her PT shorts and embedded itself in the muscle above her knee. Blood welled immediately, dark in the red light. She kept moving. The arms room was at the end of the supply corridor, a reinforced concrete room with a steel door and 2 padlocks, one the arms room lock, one her inventory lock. The inventory lock was hers. The arms room lock required either her key or Cahill's. She found Cahill at the corner of the barracks. He was sitting against the wall with his legs extended and his head tilted at an angle that living people don't achieve. A piece of mortar casing the size of a playing card had entered his neck below the left ear. He was still holding his cigarette lighter in his right hand, the flame still burning. He'd been smoking when the first round hit. Tuyen looked at him for 2 seconds. She looked at his belt. His key ring was there, the arms room master key, on a retractable lanyard clipped to his belt loop. She didn't take his key. She had her own. She stepped over Staff Sergeant Brock Cahill, the man who had told her to stay in her lane, and walked the remaining 40 meters to the arms room door. The key on her belt, 47 grams, slid into the lock. Turned. The steel door opened into darkness and the smell of gun oil and preservation grease. She found the light switch. The emergency fluorescence flickered on red-tinted, dim, sufficient. The arms room was exactly as she'd left it at 1,541 hours. Every cage locked, every weapon accounted for. The inventory she'd filed 6 hours ago was still accurate. Cage 7. The Barrett M82. A1 sat on its rack, waiting for a hand that understood it. Tuyen pulled the key ring from her belt, found the Cage 7 key, the third from the left. She'd memorized the order in her first week and opened the lock. The Barrett came off the rack heavier than she expected. 30.9 pounds. She knew the number. She had typed it into inventory reports 47 times. But knowing a number and feeling it translate into steel and polymer in your hands were different languages, and the Barrett spoke the second one with authority. She set it on the workbench, Cahill's workbench, still scattered with the disassembled M9 he'd been cleaning before his shift ended, before the cigarette, before the mortar fragment, and forced her hands to stop shaking by pressing them flat against the cold surface for 3 seconds. She counted. Counting was what she did. The Barrett Monte was a semi-automatic anti-material rifle. She knew this from Technical Manual 9100523910, which she had read cover to cover during a slow afternoon in month 3, because there was nothing else to read and the arms room didn't have Wi-Fi. Upper receiver, lower receiver, barrel assembly, bipod, recoil spring, bolt carrier group. The weapon in Cage 7 was garrison-configured, fully assembled, scope-mounted, bore-sighted to 500 meters per SOP 4-12. She would not need to build it from components. She needed to load it. Ammo Cage 3. She crossed the arms room, unlocked the cage, and found the 50 BMG ammunition in its designated position, second shelf, right side, olive drab cans stenciled with lot numbers. She selected Raufoss Mach 211 armor-piercing high explosive, incendiary. The rounds she'd logged as on hand, 40 rounds, serviceable. Each cartridge was longer than her hand and weighed 117 grams. She loaded a 10-round magazine by feel, seating each round with a press of her thumb until the follower spring resisted. The magazine clicked into the Barrett's lower receiver. She charged the bolt. The action cycled with a sound like a vault locking heavy, deliberate, final. She checked the scope. Leupold Mark 4. 4. 5. 1. 4. X. 5. 0. Millimeter. Bore sighted for 500 meters. The reticle was mil-dot, which she preferred because Ong Noi had taught her the mil relation formula before she learned algebra. She adjusted the eyepiece focus until the reticle was sharp. 10 rounds. The Barrett was operational. Radio. She needed a radio. Tuyen left the arms room, carrying the Barrett, in her right hand, 30.9 pounds, suspended from her right arm, the bipod folded, the barrel pointed at the ceiling, and her left hand pressing against the wound in her thigh. The blood had slowed but not stopped. She would deal with it later. Later was a concept that existed somewhere beyond the next 60 seconds, and the next 60 seconds belonged to the stairwell at the end of the supply corridor. In the hallway, she found what she needed. A PRC 152 tactical radio handset, dropped by someone she didn't know who, didn't care, lying against the baseboard where the corridor turned toward the Tactical Operations Center. She grabbed it, checked the channel, company net. She could hear traffic fragmented, panicked, the sound of a command structure trying to reassemble itself under fire. Actual. Quick reaction force is pinned in the motor pool. 2 urgent, surgical, request immediate suppressive fire on the east breach. PKM positions, 2 positions they're dug in. Sergeant First Class Petrova. The quick reaction force leader. Her voice was controlled, professional, and underneath the professionalism, afraid. No one responded to Petrova's call. The Tactical Operations Center was either destroyed or overwhelmed. Tuyen looked at the stairwell door. Supply Building 3 was 3 stories. The roof access was through a maintenance hatch on the 3rd floor. From the roof, she would have line of sight to the eastern perimeter, to the breach, to the PKM positions, to every target in between. She climbed. Her thigh screamed. With every step, the Barrett dragged at her right arm like an anchor. The stairwell was dark, except for the red emergency strips along the floor. 3 flights, 36 steps. She counted every one. The maintenance hatch opened onto a flat roof gravel over tar paper. HVAC units, providing the only cover, a low parapet wall that wouldn't stop a bullet, but would break a silhouette. The night sky was orange from fires. The eastern perimeter was a wound in the earth. The T-wall section collapsed. Rubble scattered in a fan pattern, muzzle flashes pulsing from positions in the debris. She saw the PKM, 720 meters east, behind a sandbag position built in the rubble of the breach. The muzzle flash was rhythmic long bursts, 5 to 7 seconds, raking the motor pool where she could see the quick reaction force huddled behind vehicles that were already burning. Tuyen lowered herself to prone behind the largest HVAC unit, unfolded the Barrett's bipod, and settled the stock into her shoulder. The metal was cold through her t-shirt. She had never fired this weapon. She was going to fire it now. The scope brought the world to her in circles. Through the Leupold's 14x magnification, the PKM position at 720 meters resolved from a flickering abstraction into a defined reality. 2 men, behind 4 layers of sandbags, the PKM's barrel glowing cherry red from sustained fire, belt ammunition snaking from a green metal can. The gunner was prone, his face pressed to the stock, firing in bursts that sent tracers arcing across the compound toward the motor pool. The assistant gunner feeder knelt beside him, guiding the belt, shouting something she couldn't hear. 720 meters. The scope was bore sighted for 500. She needed holdover. Tuyen closed her eyes for 2 seconds and did what Ong Noi had taught her to do when the mathematics of a shot exceeded the available tools. She solved it in her head. 50 BMG, Mach 211 round, left the Barrett's muzzle at 2,910 feet per second. At 720 meters, assuming standard atmospheric conditions, which these were not, but she'd adjust the bullet would experience approximately 87 inches of drop beyond the 500 meter zero. Air temperature. Estimated 55 degrees Fahrenheit. October night in southeastern Turkey. Altitude. Approximately 850 meters above sea level. Wind. She wet her finger and held it up. 8 knots from the southwest, roughly 45 degrees off the line of fire. Wind correction at 720 meters with an 8-knot crosswind. Approximately 2 MOA right. She did not have a Kestrel weather meter. She did not have a dope book. She did not have a spotter. She had the numbers in her head, the scope on the rifle, and 14 months of touching this weapon without ever firing it. She dialed the elevation turret. The motor pool was dying. She could hear it through the radio, Petrova's voice. Thinner now, the professional control fraying. Actual quick reaction force is Winchester on 5.56. We have 4 casualties. Where is our fire support? Silence on the net. Tuyen keyed the PRC. 152. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by that. Quick reaction force. This is supply. I have eyes on the East PKM position. Engaging. A pause. Then Petrova. Supply? Who the identify yourself? Supply building 3. Rooftop. Stand by. She found the respiratory pause. The Quang Larng. The crosshairs settled on the PKM gunner's torso center mass, the largest target, the surest hit at a range where she had no confirmed data. She breathed out the bullet. The Barrett roared. The recoil was nothing she had prepared for. 23 years of shooting experience. 22. 30-06. M4. M249. M240. And nothing in that catalog approximated the 50 BMG's detonation. The stock slammed her shoulder with 39 foot-pounds of force, drove her body backward on the gravel, and left a ringing in her ears that swallowed every other sound. The muzzle flash was a sunburst that whited out her scope picture. She recovered. Found the scope. Found the target. The sandbag position was obscured by smoke. The Raufoss round armor-piercing, high-explosive, incendiary had done what the technical manual said it would do. The sandbags were torn apart. The PKM's barrel was bent at an angle that defied metallurgy. 2 men down. Neither was moving. 9 rounds remaining. Quick reaction force. Supply. Near PKM is neutralized. 2. Ekia. Shifting to far position. Petrova's voice came back, and the fraying was gone, replaced by something raw. Supply Roger. Far PKM is 350 degrees from your position. Estimate range 700 to 800 meters. They're behind the collapsed T-wall section. Tuyen panned the scope right. Found the second muzzle flash. Confirmed. PKM. Behind rubble. Approximately 750 meters. 2 more fighters. Her shoulder was already bruising. Blood from her thigh had pooled beneath her left knee, warm against the gravel. The Barrett's barrel radiated heat she could feel through the handguard. She adjusted, calculated, breathed. She fired again. The second shot missed. She knew it before the bullet arrived, felt it in the recoil, in the fractional shift of the bipod on loose gravel, in the way the crosshairs had drifted 6 inches left at the moment of trigger break. The round struck the collapsed T-wall 3 feet below the PKM position, detonating against concrete with a flash of incendiary that illuminated the rubble field but killed nothing. 8 rounds. Tuyen's jaw clenched. She forced it loose. Ong Noi's rule number 1. Tension in the face means tension in the hands means the rifle lies. She adjusted. The mist told her what she needed. Her windage correction was insufficient at this range. The crosswind had picked up. She added 1 click right, a quarter MOA, less than an inch at the muzzle, 14 inches at 750 meters. The difference between a kill and a headline, the PKM gunner at the far position had not stopped firing. He either hadn't seen the flash from her rooftop or didn't care. Amateurs, she thought. Then corrected herself. Amateurs who were killing her people. She found the respiratory pause. Fired. The Raufoss round crossed 750 meters in 0.9 of a second and struck the PKM's receiver, the junction where barrel met body. The heart of the weapon. The Mach 211's explosive component detonated on impact. The PKM disintegrated. The gunner's hands, which had been on the weapon, ceased to exist as a functional concept. The assistant gunner scrambled backward. Tuyen tracked him through the scope, a panicked figure, silhouetted by fire, trying to reach cover behind a section of T-wall. She fired. 7 rounds. He dropped. Quick reaction force, supply. Both PKM positions neutralized. 4 IKEA. Corridor to the breach is open. Petrova's response was immediate. Quick reaction force moving. Supply. Maintain overwatch. Maintain overwatch. As if she were a fire support element. As if she were a designated marksman with a spotter and a sector sketch and authorization. She was a supply specialist in PT clothes with a stolen radio and a rifle she'd learned from YouTube, lying in her own blood on a rooftop, and a sergeant first class was giving her fire support commands. She maintained overwatch. Through the scope, the breach zone was chaos. Fighters were moving in the rubble. She counted 6, 7, possibly 8, at distances ranging from 400 to 600 meters. Some were firing toward the motor pool. Others were moving deeper into the compound, toward the barracks, toward the tactical operations center, toward the aid station where the wounded were being treated. Positive identification. The rules of engagement burned in her mind. Every soldier learned them, even supply clerks. She could not fire at a shape. She had to confirm. Armed, hostile, presenting a threat. She scanned, found a figure at 480 meters, moving along the interior wall of the compound, carrying an AK pattern rifle with a magazine inserted. Armed, hostile, heading toward the aid station. She fired. 6 rounds. The figure fell. She found another. 520 meters, crouching behind a destroyed Humvee, aiming an RPG-7 toward the motor pool. The RPG's warhead was visible in the scope. PG, 7VL. She identified it automatically, the way she identified everything in the arms room, by shape and catalog number. She fired. The round hit the fighter center mass. The Raufoss component detonated. The RPG's warhead sympathetically detonated a half-second later. The Humvee's remaining fuel tank caught. 5 rounds. She was counting. She had always been counting. Ammunition in crates, serial numbers on receivers, mortar impacts per week, days until rotation, rounds remaining in the magazine. The numbers were the structure she imposed on a world that had never bothered to structure itself around her. 5 rounds. 6 kills. The math was efficient. Ong Noi would have called it acceptable. The 7th and 8th targets were together. 2 fighters, 430 meters, moving in a low crouch along the drainage ditch that ran between the motor pool and the eastern barracks. They were flanking, attempting to get behind Petrova's quick reaction force as it advanced through the breach corridor. One carried an AK-74. The other had a belt of PKM ammunition draped over his shoulders, heading for a weapon that no longer existed. Tuyen tracked the lead fighter. He moved with more discipline than the others, controlled, deliberate, using the ditch for cover, pausing at intervals to scan. Trained, not a conscript. She waited until he paused. The respiratory pause, within the respiratory pause. Crosshairs. On his upper chest. Fired. 4 rounds. He dropped into the ditch. The second fighter froze. The worst possible reaction. The decision to stop moving when every instinct should have screamed run. She shifted the crosshairs, one body width right and down. Fired. 3 rounds. 8 kills. The magazine was thinning. Each trigger pull now carried a weight beyond recoil. The weight of scarcity, of knowing that the ammunition she had was the ammunition she would ever have. Ammo cage 3 was 3 flights of stairs below her, and she was not leaving this roof. The compound was quieting. Not silence, the silence would come later. After the adrenaline and the cordite cleared, but a reduction. The sustained automatic fire had fragmented into sporadic bursts. The sound of fighters who were losing coherence, whose plan had been to overwhelm, and who were now discovering that the overwhelmed had teeth. Petrova's quick reaction force was moving through the breach. Tuyen could see them in the scope, fire teams bounding. One covering while the other advanced, the choreography of infantry doctrine, performed by soldiers who had almost died 10 minutes ago, and were now performing with the desperate precision of people who understood what the alternative looked like. Then the headlights appeared. East, on the access road that connected Camp Resolute to the provincial highway, 2 vehicles. She identified them as Toyota Hilux trucks through the scope's magnification, the ubiquitous workhorses of irregular warfare. White paint, visible under road dust. The lead vehicle had a modification she recognized from intelligence briefings she wasn't supposed to attend, but had read the summaries of anyway. A DSK 12.7mm heavy machine gun mounted on a welded pedestal in the truck bed. If the DSK reached effective range 1,500 meters, possibly further with a competent gunner, it would tear through the compound's remaining defenses like the T-wall had never existed. The 50 caliber rounds from a DSK were the same caliber she was firing. She understood, viscerally, what they would do to human bodies. Range to the lead vehicle, 1,100 meters. 3 rounds. Tuyen had never fired at 1,100 meters. Ng Ngo's farm was 600 meters at its longest dimension. The Barrett's bore sight was 500 meters. Every shot beyond that was mental math, performed under conditions that no technical manual had anticipated: blood loss, adrenaline, a scope she'd never calibrated, a rifle she'd never zeroed, on a rooftop she'd only ever visited to fix the HVAC, she calculated. Drop at 1,100 meters, approximately 210 inches below the 500 meter zero. She couldn't dial that much elevation. The turret didn't have enough travel. She would have to hold over aim above the target by the estimated drop distance, using the mil-dot reticle as a ruler. Wind. The crosswind had shifted, now blowing from the south, roughly 90 degrees off the line of fire. Stronger, maybe 12 knots. Correction. She didn't have time to calculate precisely. She estimated. 4 MOA right. The lead truck was closing at approximately 40 kilometers per hour. In 30 seconds, it would be at 900 meters. In 60 seconds, 700. She had time. She also didn't. She aimed at the engine block. Not the gunner. Not the driver, the engine. A vehicle kill would stop both the truck and the DSK. The Raufoss round was designed for exactly this. Armor. Piercing through light vehicle armor. Incendiary to ignite fuel and hydraulics. She held the crosshairs 9 mil dots above the truck's hood, 4 dots right for wind, breathed in the math. Breathed out the bullet. The Barrett roared for the 8th time that night. The bullet crossed 1,100 meters in 1.4 seconds. It struck the Hilux's engine block offset from center. She'd missed the dead center she'd aimed for. But the Raufoss didn't care about precision at the component level. It cared about detonation. The round penetrated the sheet metal hood, entered the engine compartment, and its explosive filling detonated inside the block. The truck's front end lifted. The engine seized. Steam and flame erupted from the hood. The Hilux slewed sideways. Its front wheels locked and skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust and burning coolant. 2 rounds. The DSHK was still mounted. Its gunner was alive. She could see him through the scope, recovering from the vehicle's sudden stop, swinging the heavy weapon toward the compound. She shifted aim. The DSHK's ammunition belt was visible, a linked chain of 12.7mm rounds feeding from an open can bolted to the mount. If she hit the ammunition, she fired. 1 round remaining. The Raufoss struck the ammunition can. The result was immediate and absolute. The 12.7mm rounds cooked off in a chain detonation that turned the truck bed into a forge. The DSHK's barrel peeled upward like a flower stem. The gunner disappeared. The fuel tank, ruptured by fragmentation, caught 3 seconds later. The fireball rose 40 feet. The second truck, no mounted weapon, carrying fighters in the bed, braked hard, reversed, and fled east toward the highway. 1 round. Tuyen's hands were shaking again, not from fear, from blood loss. Her thigh had been bleeding, for she checked her watch, but her vision was blurring at the edges, and the numbers swam a long time, long enough that her fingers were cold and her heart was beating too fast. The body's desperate attempt to circulate what remained. She needed a tourniquet. She didn't have one. She was wearing PT shorts and a t-shirt. She pulled the t-shirt over her head, twisted it into a cord, and wrapped it around her thigh above the wound. She tightened it with the Barrett's cleaning rod, improvised windlass tourniquet. The kind the combat medic had demonstrated during a training she'd attended voluntarily and been mocked for attending. The bleeding slowed. 1 round. 1 t-shirt. The rooftop October air was cold against her bare skin. She settled behind the scope again. Below her, the war was ending. Petrova's quick reaction force had pushed through the breach corridor and was clearing the rubble field in textbook fashion fire teams, leapfrogging, grenades into suspicious positions, short controlled bursts into confirmed threats. The compound's remaining defenders had joined from the western side, a ragged assemblage of soldiers who had found weapons and purpose in the chaos. The surviving fighters from the assault force, how many remained, Tuyen couldn't tell, were being compressed into a shrinking perimeter around the collapsed eastern wall. She provided what the doctrine called overwatch and what she called counting. Through the scope, she tracked movement. Most of it was friendly now. She identified American soldiers by their movement patterns, by the shape of their helmets, by the way they communicated with hand signals instead of shouting. The remaining hostiles moved differently, reactive, disorganized, the behavior of men whose plan had collapsed and whose extraction had just burned on the access road. She found a target, a single fighter, 400 meters, moving along the interior wall toward the aid station, a reinforced tent on the southern edge of the compound, where the company's medics were treating the wounded. He carried an AK-47 with a taped magazine. He moved with purpose. He knew where the aid station was. Tuyen's last round, she calculated. At 400 meters, well within the bore sight 0, the holdover was minimal. Wind correction, negligible at this range. The shot was, by every metric she could measure, routine, except that her hands were shaking. Her vision was narrowing, not the focused tunnel of concentration, but the involuntary constriction of a body running low on blood. Her heart rate was elevated. She could feel it in her temples, a rapid thudding that made the crosshairs pulse with each beat. She gripped the Barrett tighter, forced her breathing into the pattern Ong Noi had drilled into her, until it was more reliable than instinct. 4 seconds in, hold. 4 seconds out, hold. Fire in the pause. The fighter was 20 meters from the aid station. She could see the tent's entrance through the scope, the red cross on its canvas flap. Inside, wounded soldiers. Her people she served meals to in the chow hall, people whose ammunition she counted, people who had never learned her name. She breathed in. Breathe in the meth. She breathed out. Breathe out the bullet. The Barrett fired its last round. The fighter dropped 20 meters from the aid station door. He did not get up. 15. She counted 15. The Barrett's bolt locked back on an empty magazine. The action was open. The chamber empty. The weapon finished. Tuyen lowered her head to the gravel and felt the rooftop's cold surface against her forehead. The scope's eyepiece pressed into her brow. 15 targets. 10 rounds. 17 minutes. The numbers were clean. They always were. Numbers didn't judge. Numbers didn't mock. Numbers didn't tell you to stay in your lane. She was very cold. The tourniquet was holding, but the blood she'd already lost was gone, and her body was beginning the long negotiation between consciousness and conservation that the combat medic had described during that same training she'd been mocked for attending. Stage 2. Hypovolemia. Tachycardia. Peripheral vasoconstriction. Altered mental status. She keyed the radio. Her voice came from very far away. Quick. Reaction force. Supply. Last round expended. 15. 15. Ikia confirmed. She lost the word. Found it. I'm staying on the roof. Can't move. Petrova. Supply. Roger. Hold position. We're sending someone to you. Copy. She set the radio down. She set the Barrett beside her. She looked at the sky, which was turning from black to the gray-blue of pre-dawn, the stars fading like names she couldn't remember. She started counting them. She got to 47 before she lost consciousness. Sergeant First Class Anya Petrova had been in the army for 9 years, and she had never heard anything like it. Not the Barrett she knew. The sound of a .50 caliber. Had heard them in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in training ranges from Bening to Yakima. She knew the concussive report, the way it flattened other sounds, the authority of it. What she had never heard was that sound coming from Supply Building 3, identified by a voice she didn't recognize, on a call sign that didn't exist, eliminating targets with a precision that bordered on mechanical. Supply. That's all the voice had said. Not a name, not a rank, not a unit. Supply. The breach was secured at 0404 hours 17 minutes after the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device detonated. Petrova's quick reaction force had cleared the rubble field, neutralized or captured the remaining fighters, and established a perimeter that would hold until reinforcements arrived from Incirlik. The body count on the hostile side was 23 confirmed dead, 4 captured. An unknown number who had fled east. The garrison's losses: 3 KIA, including Staff Sergeant Cahill, 11 WIA, 2 urgent surgical, already medical evacuationed. And somewhere on the roof of Supply Building 3, the person who had made the difference was not answering the radio. Supply. This is Quick Reaction Force Actual. Say status. Over. Static. Supply. Quick Reaction Force Actual. Acknowledge. Nothing. Petrova looked at Staff Sergeant Ren Kobayashi, the support platoon's NCO, who had materialized from the chaos with body armor over pajamas and a confused expression that was slowly calcifying into something worse. Kobayashi. Who works in Supply Building 3? That's the arms room and the logistics office, Sergeant First Class. Who has rooftop access? Kobayashi's face did something complicated. The HVAC maintenance team and the supply specialist. Specialist Ngo. Ngo. Petrova tested the name. It meant nothing to her. She'd been at Camp Resolute for 4 months, and she did not know who Specialist Ngo was. Get someone up there. Now. Specialist Emmett Voss went. He was the closest, a Signal Corps soldier from the Tactical Operations Center who had spent the attack on the floor beneath his desk, which he would later describe as a tactical position with a degree of sincerity that fooled no one. The stairwell was dark. Voss climbed with his flashlight in one hand and his M9 in the other. Because the training said, clear your sectors even when the fighting is over, and the training was all he had. He reached the 3rd floor, found the maintenance hatch, pushed it open. Dawn was coming. The sky was the color of old bruises, purple-gray, shot through with orange from the fires still burning at the eastern perimeter. The rooftop was gravel over tar paper, HVAC units, a low parapet wall, and behind the largest HVAC unit, a girl. That was his first thought, and he would be ashamed of it later. A girl. She was small, 5'4", maybe 5'5", and she was lying prone behind a Barrett M82, a one that looked larger than she was. She wore PT shorts and no shirt, just a sports bra, because her t-shirt was knotted around her left thigh in a tourniquet that was soaked through with blood. Her skin was gray-brown in the pre-dawn light. Her eyes were closed. Beside her, 10 spent brass casings, each one the size of a cigar, scattered on the gravel like discarded prayers. Voss knelt, checked her pulse, found it fast, thready, the pulse of someone losing the argument with blood loss, but not yet finished arguing. He keyed his radio. Actual. This is Voss. I found supply. It's Specialist Ngo. From logistics. She needs a medical evacuation now. A pause. Petrova's voice. Say again. Specialist Ngo? The supply clerk? Affirmative. She's up here with the Barrett. He looked at the brass casings, counted them, looked at the Barrett's empty magazine, looked at the girl who weighed less than the rifle. She's the one who did it. Sergeant First Class. The pause that followed was the loudest silence Camp Resolute had ever produced. Captain Derek Hargrove was not having a good morning. The eastern perimeter of his compound had been breached by a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. 3 of his soldiers were dead. 11 were wounded. His armorer was among the dead. His quick reaction force had been pinned for 12 minutes by machine gun fire that should have been suppressed by the fire support assets he didn't have because CENTCOM had determined that Camp Resolute was a low threat as environment and allocated resources accordingly. And now First Sergeant Ruiz was standing in front of him in the Tactical Operations Center, holding a personnel file and wearing an expression that Hargrove associated with imminent career damage. Sir, you need to see this. I need to see the casualty reports. First Sergeant, I need to see the ammo count. I need to see the sitrep for hire. I do not need to see a personnel file. He checked his watch, 0517. With respect, sir, you need to see this. Ruiz set the file on the table. It was thin, the file of someone who had done nothing, notable enough to generate paperwork beyond the standard. Specialist Tuyen Ngo, Military Occupational Specialty, 92Y, Unit Supply Specialist. Assigned to Camp Resolute 14 months ago. No disciplinary actions. No awards. No combat deployments prior to this one. Performance reviews. Meets standards across the board. Which was the military's way of saying, we don't know enough about this person to say anything meaningful. Ruiz opened the file to a specific page and pointed. Qualification records. Hargrove read them. Then read them again. M4. A1 expert. Score, 39 of 40. M9 expert. Score, 295 of 300. M249. SAW expert. Score, first in cycle. M240B. Expert. Score, first in cycle. M2 Browning, 50 caliber. Expert. Score, first in cycle. At the bottom, a handwritten annotation from her drill sergeant at Fort Jackson. Recommend reassignment to infantry or sniper pipeline. Soldier possesses exceptional natural ability. Marksmanship scores are 3 points below the all-time installation record. This soldier is wasted in logistics. Hargrove stared at the annotation. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the handwriting of a drill sergeant who had bothered to pick up a pen because typing wasn't urgent enough. This was in her file the entire time. Yes, sir. We had this soldier, this qualification record, in our compound for 14 months. Yes, sir. And she was counting ammunition. Yes, sir. Hargrove closed the file. He did not slam it. He set it down with the careful precision of a man who understood that the file was evidence. Evidence of a systemic failure that had his fingerprints on it, along with Cahill's, along with every NCO and officer in the chain of command who had processed Specialist Tuyen Ngo's assignment and never thought to check what else she could do. Where is she now? Forward surgical team. She lost approximately 2 units of blood from a shrapnel wound sustained during the initial barrage. Tourniquet self-applied, improvised from her T-shirt. Ruiz paused. She was firing from the rooftop in a sports bra, sir. In October. For 17 minutes, Hargrove said nothing for a long time. He looked at the Tactical Operations Center's wall-mounted map, where the attack's geometry was being reconstructed by his operations officer, the breach, the PKM positions, the approach route, the technical vehicles on the access road, red pins for confirmed enemy Kia. 23 total. 15 of them had small yellow flags, eliminated by Barrett M82. A 1 from Supply Building 3. 15 of 23. 65%. By a specialist who had never fired the weapon before tonight. I want to see her, Hargrove said. The field surgical team operated out of a modular tent system that smelled of betadine, burnt coffee, and the specific metallic tang of blood that hadn't dried yet. Tuyen was on a cot in the post-op section, an IV in her right arm, a fresh dressing on her left thigh. A thermal blanket over her body, because her temperature had dropped to 35.1 Celsius during the surgery to remove the shrapnel fragment, and she had not yet recovered. She was awake. She had been awake since the morphine wore off, which was approximately 40 minutes, which she knew because she had been counting the drip rate of her IV. 20 drops per minute, lactated ringers, 1-liter bag, estimated completion in 3 hours and 12 minutes. Counting, always counting. Captain Hargrove appeared at the tent flap at 0930 hours. He was wearing body armor over his uniform, which meant the threat level had not been downgraded, and his face wore the expression of a man who had prepared a speech and was now realizing that no speech would be adequate. He pulled a folding chair to her bedside and sat. Specialist Tuyen Ngo. Sir. How are you feeling? Functional, sir. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. She had spent 14 months not looking at officers, keeping her eyes on clipboards, inventory screens, the floor, and she found that looking directly at Captain Hargrove was easier than she'd expected. He was just a man who had not known her name until this morning. I've reviewed the after-action report, he said. 15 confirmed. IKEA. Barrett M82. A 1. 10 rounds. Engagement ranges from 380 to 1,000. 100 meters. 2 crew-served weapons positions neutralized. 1 technical vehicle destroyed. He paused. You did this in 17 minutes. Yes, sir. You were not qualified on the M82 A1. No, sir. You accessed the arms room with your inventory key, retrieved the weapon, loaded it, carried it to the rooftop, and engaged targets at ranges up to 1,100 meters, with a weapon you had never fired. I had handled it during inventory, every week for 14 months. She paused. I know that weapon, sir. I know every weapon in that arms room, by serial number, by function, by specification. I didn't know how it felt to fire it. That was the only part I didn't know. Hargrove opened his mouth, closed it. He reached into his cargo pocket and produced a folder, her personnel file, the same one Ruiz had shown him. He opened it to the qualification page and set it on her blanket. Your drill sergeant recommended you for reclassification to combat arms. Infantry or sniper pipeline? Yes, sir. I'm aware. The recommendation was never acted on. No, sir. Why didn't you push it? File a request. Talk to someone. Tuyen looked at the qualification page. The numbers were there. The same numbers they had always been. The numbers nobody had bothered to read. I did talk to someone, sir. I asked Staff Sergeant Cahill about cross-training on the Barrett 2 months after I arrived. He told me to stay in my lane. She met his eyes. I asked Staff Sergeant Kobayashi about a range qualification opportunity. She submitted the request. It was denied at company level, not enough slots for support personnel. She paused. I asked, "Sir." Nobody listened. She didn't say it with anger. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, precisely. With the economy of a person who had learned that words, like ammunition, should not be wasted. Hargrove sat with that. The silence in the tent was different from the silence on the radio. This one had weight. The weight of institutional failure wearing a captain's rank. "I'm recommending you for the Silver Star," he said. "And I'm submitting a reclassification request. If you want it, I want it, sir." He nodded. He stood. He replaced the chair. At the tent flap, he stopped. "Specialist Tuyen Ngo." "Sir, I'm sorry." She looked at him, at the man who commanded a compound of 143 soldiers, who had walked past her in the chow hall and the supply corridor and the motor pool for 14 months without once asking what she could do. "Thank you, sir," she said. Not for the apology, for the Silver Star. For the reclassification. She didn't need his sorry. She needed his signature. The satellite phone weighed 340 grams. Tuyen knew this, because she had shipped 6 of them during her tenure in supply, and the shipping weight, including packaging, battery, and antenna cap, was listed on Form DD. 1149. Block 16. 490. 3 grams, of which 340 grams was the handset itself. She held it in her right hand. The left was occupied by the IV line, and dialed the number she had memorized before she memorized her own social security number. 11 digits. Country code. Area code. The landline at the farmhouse in the Blue Ridge Mountains that Ngo Ngo refused to replace with a cell phone because, he said, "A phone that follows you is a leash." 3 rings, then a voice weathered by 81 years. 3 wars. And an ocean crossing on a fishing boat. Ido. Ngo Ngo. It's Tuyen. A pause. The pause of a man who had been a soldier long enough to know that calls from deployment came in 2 varieties, routine and catastrophic. The time 0100 Virginia time eliminated routine. "Are you hurt?" "Yes, not badly." "Shrapnel. I'm in the hospital." "Where?" "I can't say." "Of course." Another pause. She could hear the farmhouse behind his silence, the creak of the porch chair. The distant sound of wind through the tobacco field. The particular quality of Virginia darkness that she had not realized she missed until this moment. "What happened?" She told him. Not the classified details, not the unit, not the location, not the operational name. She told him what mattered. The breach, the arms room, Cage 7, the Barrett, the rooftop. He listened without interrupting. He had always listened without interrupting, because Ngo Ngo believed that a story, like a bullet, should be allowed to reach its target without interference. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. How many rounds? 10. How many targets? 15. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Tuyen counted. Acceptable. She closed her eyes. From Ngo Ngo, a man who had survived the Tet Offensive, the fall of Saigon, a re-education camp, and a refugee's ocean crossing, acceptable was the highest commendation in his vocabulary. It meant, you did what was required. You did not do less. You did not waste. Your shoulder? He asked. Bruised. The recoil was more than I expected. The Barrett is a different animal. The M1 taught you to breathe. The Barrett teaches you to endure. He paused. You endured? I endured? Good. Another silence. She heard him shift in the chair, the creak of old wood, old bones, old certainties. Come home when they let you, he said. The tobacco needs cutting. The Garand needs oiling. I've been waiting for someone to shoot with. Her eyes burned. Not from pain. I'll come home, Ong Noi. I know. You are my granddaughter. You come home. The call lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds. She counted. When the line went dead, she held the phone against her chest and listened to her own heartbeat. Slow now. Steady. The heartbeat of someone who had finished counting for the night. She looked at the photograph on her bedside table, retrieved from her bunk by Kobayashi, who had thought of it without being asked. Ong Noi, 30 years old, in ARVN tiger stripes, holding the M1 Garand in front of a military compound in Pleiku. A young man in an old war, holding a weapon from an older war, looking at the camera with an expression that said, I will survive this, and so will what I carry. Tuyen set the phone down. She pulled the thermal blanket to her chin. She closed her eyes. She slept without counting. For the first time in 14 months, there was nothing left to count. 6 weeks later, Specialist Tuyen Ngo returned to Camp Resolute to clear her belongings. And the compound she returned to was not the one she had left. The eastern perimeter had been rebuilt, new T-wall sections, a reinforced guard tower, a secondary barrier that hadn't existed before. The motor pool had new vehicles. The barracks had new windows. Supply Building 3 had a new HVAC system on the roof, and, she noticed, a small square of concrete near the largest unit that was lighter than the surrounding surface, as though someone had pressure-washed a very specific area. She knew what the stain had been. The garrison knew who she was now. That was the part she hadn't prepared for. She walked from the gate to the supply building, a distance of 200 meters, and every soldier she passed acknowledged her. Not with words, some nodded, some stepped aside. One, private, saluted, and then remembered that specialists didn't rate salutes, and turned the motion into an awkward wave. The silence that surrounded her was no longer the silence of invisibility. It was the silence of people who didn't know what to say. She hated it. Not the recognition. She was honest enough with herself to admit that recognition, after 14 months of anonymity, carried a warmth she hadn't expected. What she hated was the asymmetry. They knew her name now because she had killed 15 men with a rifle she'd taught herself to shoot. They hadn't known her name when she was counting their ammunition, filing their requisitions, ensuring that every weapon they carried was maintained and accounted for. The invisible work had sustained them. The violent work had earned her a silver star. She understood the lesson. She didn't have to like it. The Silver Star ceremony had been small. A battalion-level formation at the camp's parade ground. The battalion commander reading the citation while Tuyen stood at attention in dress uniform with a brace on her left leg. The citation was precise. It listed the engagement ranges, the target count, the impact on the compound's defense, the improvised tourniquet. It did not list the YouTube videos. It did not mention Ong Noi. First Sergeant Ruiz pinned the medal. Captain Hargrove shook her hand. Petrova, standing in the formation's front rank, saluted a salute that held 2 seconds longer than regulation required, which in Army language meant everything Petrova couldn't say in front of a battalion. Now, 6 weeks later, Tuyen stood in the arms room one last time. It was exactly as she'd left it. The fluorescent tubes still buzzed at 60 hertz. The workbench still held Cahill's tools, though another armorer, Staff Sergeant Kimura, had reorganized them. The cages were locked. The inventory was current. Cage 7 was empty. The Barrett M82, A1, serial T41, had been sent to Ordnance for forensic inspection and ballistic verification. 10 rounds fired. 15 confirmed kills. The weapon would eventually be returned, re-zeroed, and placed back in its cage for the next supply specialist to inventory. In the empty cage, someone had taped a note to the rack. 15 for 10. Petrova Tuyen. Read the note. En cas 3. En can. R. En da. En da. En. She didn't take it. She didn't need souvenirs. She remembered everything by the numbers, and the numbers were already part of her, written in the tissue of her shoulder, where the Barrett's recoil had left its signature, in the scar on her left thigh, where the shrapnel had entered, and the surgeon had removed it, in the quiet space between her heartbeats, where the Quang Larng lived. She locked the arms room for the last time. She removed the key from her belt, 47 grams, the same weight it had always been, and hung it on the hook beside the door, where the next supply specialist would find it on their first day and carry it without knowing its history. She walked to the flight line where a C-130J waited, its engines already running, its cargo ramp open like a mouth. Her sea bag was in her right hand. Her duffel was over her left shoulder. There was no rifle case this time. She was traveling as a passenger, not an armorer. Her orders read: Fort Benning, Georgia. Infantry 1 Station Unit Training. Military Occupational Specialty Reclassification from 92Y to 11B. She climbed the ramp, found a seat, buckled the lap belt. The loadmaster gave the signal. The ramp closed. The engines roared. Specialist Tuyen Ngo did not look back at Camp Resolute. She had counted everything in it. Every crate, every serial number, every round, every life, and the count was complete. There was nothing left to inventory. She closed her eyes. Ahead of her was Fort Benning, and after Benning, whatever came next. Sniper school, deployment, the next arms room, with the next weapons. She would learn by touch and number and patience. She would count those too. She would always count, but she would never again count from behind a locked cage. The C-130 lifted off. The desert fell away beneath her. She slept, and in her sleep, she heard the Garan's clip eject with its bright metallic ping, and Ong Noi's voice saying the only word that mattered: acceptable.